last semester, I guess, with a 3-part series on Leonardo da Vinci. And we were able to really look in depth at this great master's work, both his scientific work as well as his artistic work, because he was really a Renaissance man in the sense of being an expert in many different fields. As we mentioned before, he did have a problematic relationship with Michelangelo, who was his great rival, as well as a younger man, almost 20 years younger than Leonardo. When Leonardo had returned from his stint in Milan in 1499, Michelangelo was now the most important upcoming artist in the city. And he found that he had a real rival in Michelangelo. So we're going to, and he makes an interesting comparison with Leonardo, because whereas Leonardo is very removed and objective and unemotional, Michelangelo is passionate, and he's has a temper, and he has all those signs that they used to say, born under Saturn, born under with that melancholic personality. You know, they had these 4 personality types during the Renaissance. They thought they were these humors that existed in the body: blood, black bile, yellow bile, and black bile was the sign of melancholy and the sign of Mercury. And Michelangelo is often cited as a melancholic sort of personality. So he makes an interesting contrast with Leonardo, not only as a man, but also as an artist. And we'll see that both of these high Renaissance masters influence each other, but Michelangelo wants to clearly differentiate himself from the older master. And one of the problems is that Leonardo had said that, that sculpture is really an inferior art form to painting, because whereas a gentleman and a scholar and an intellectual may create whole worlds in his perspectival system and oil paints, he can make angels float and so forth. Sculptors are more earthbound, they're more materialistic. They sweat when they pound on their marble, they sweat when they're in the foundry pouring bronze, that it is really more of not a gentlemanly art, it is more of a manual art. So Leonardo was kind of able to build up his own painting and the position of painting in society on this basis, by saying that it really, by contrasting with a sculpture. Michelangelo, of course, disagreed with this, because Michelangelo is above all a sculptor. And in fact,
all of these factors brought hordes really of African Americans north looking for.
Wunderbar. What was I saying? Doesn't matter. So we're going to look at him. He lives to be very, very old, as you can see. And that's why 3 hours is really just the kind of minimum to spend on this artist. This is from a portrait that's in Florence by Jacopino del Conte. They used to think it was a self-portrait, but they know now it's not. It's one of his followers, made when he was in his early 60s, the mature master. We get to see that broken nose that was the result of him smarting off to another apprentice while he was in the workshop of the master, his master with Ghirlandaio. So I want to start by just reaffirming some things we had already discussed in terms not only of Leonardo, but of that whole circle of Lorenzo the Magnificent and Botticelli and the end of the 1400s. And as we saw there, idealization of form was the goal of art. Art was not to simply imitate nature with all its imperfections, but rather was to show nature as it might be in a perfect world, in a world of pure ideas. And that's where we get the ideal, comes from that idea of idea. And in fact, I guess one way of putting it would be that artists were trying to give form to the perfect ideas that as they existed in the mind of God, invisible, beyond our understanding, but the artist then being sort of almost a mediumistic being that through the mediation of his art and his craft, the divine force can come through him. And that's one reason that Michelangelo was called Il Divino, or the divine Michelangelo, because it seemed that such incredible gifts that seemed to come fully formed out of Michelangelo's head, this idealization of form is taken to higher and higher levels by Michelangelo. And his earliest experiences are there in the late Florence of the 70s. Okay, just as an overview of idealization of form, here is his sculpture, and it's rather late in his career, of the risen Christ. And Christ is incredibly beautiful. He looks like he's maybe 22, 23 years old. His body is not marked up or beaten. It's after his resurrection. He holds his cross kind of triumphant, as well as the stick and the sponge that they used to give him water on the cross. He looks back to the ancient Greco-Roman world of antiquity. And this is a copy of a famous statue by Polyclitus. And we've looked at this in earlier lectures if you haven't if you remember from those. But if not, Polyclitus was trying to create a canon of perfect human proportions. And it was all based on the second knuckle of the right hand finger. This was the same length of an eye. And there was to be one of these between the two eyes. And everything was measured out proportionally as a ratio of this one modular aspect of the man's form. And so he also wrote a treatise, but it's lost. But he made the statue that was an example of it. And as we can see, this ideal of form that they came up with in 5th century BC Greece is still very much the ideal of form that we look at today as the ideal of form. So it has kind of an eternal aspect. And I think that what Michelangelo was trying to do was to tune in to that same humanism that had given rise to these great works of antiquity and take it even farther, higher, more perfect. And I think in his Christ, he really does achieve this. It has a softness to it, a flaccidity of the flesh that you can see, for example, here. It's soft. Look at how the flesh creases slightly here. This is something that doesn't happen in the Doryphorus, who is just absolutely perfect. So Michelangelo seeks not just to equal the ancients, but to exceed them. And I think there can be a strong argument that that's actually what he achieved. As I said, he was called the divine, mostly because of his extraordinary skill that seems to have happened almost completely naturally. Michelangelo was apprenticed to a leading Florentine painter, Ghirlandaio, in the late 1400s, but he never finished his apprenticeship. He only was an apprentice for 2 years, never had made it to that level of journeyman even within the studio of Ghirlandaio, was the lowest rung. But they did recognize that he was really talented because Ghirlandaio actually pays Michelangelo as a 13-year-old assistant, and that is very unusual. Typically, the person's skilled, he'll take him on free. But very often the case was the father would have to pay some sort of stipend because the young man would move into the studio, would move into the workshop of the maestro. And this is what exactly happened to Michelangelo. When he was about 13, he entered the workshop of Ghirlandaio as an apprentice. Ghirlandaio was a painter of the same generation of Sandro Botticelli. He had a large and very successful studio in Florence. And so he was one of the main artists that you would go to for major commissions. And this is a small easel painting that he has of the Adoration of the Magi, or of the wise men that come from the east to worship the Christ child. And in this particular one, it's interesting because the wise men are dressed not in ancient biblical costume, but in modern costume, right, in the costume of the time. And they seem to approach Bethlehem through a triumphal arch that looks like it came from the Roman Forum. Likewise, this stable is just barely a stable. It looks like a stable built in the ruins of a Roman temple, and it almost looks like a sarcophagus here. But I guess it's a watering trough or a manger. But I wanted to point out that this is Ghirlandaio. He puts himself as one of the shepherds that comes earlier to visit Jesus, and then the Magi come later. By the way, in Florence, and this is one thing I missed this year, every year they have a parade of the three kings, and they start at the Pitti Palace on the other side of the Arno River and come across the Ponte Vecchio with camels and horses and in Renaissance costumes and with men with trumpets and jugglers. And it's just an incredible pageant that actually has been going on since the time of the Medici. And so maybe in some ways, this is more of a depiction of the contemporaneous celebration of the visit of the Magi. Also, I want to mention, just in passing, that in that this looks like a Roman sarcophagus rather than the sort of manger or feeding trough or watering trough that you'd had for animals, it suggests his death, right? So there's these intimations of his burial at the same time as there is of his birth. It's an interesting painting. Ghirlandaio is a serious and solid artist to study with. And Michelangelo was lucky that he got started that early. One of the things he was involved with was the decoration of the paintings behind the high altar at the Church of Santa Maria Novella, which is a beautiful Gothic church that's right across from the train station. When you come out of the train station, there it is, right in front of you. If you go in there, Ghirlandaio and his extensive, very large workshop got commissioned by the Medici family to decorate this chapel with a life of Mary. A lot of it, some of it based on the Bible, but a lot of it based on legends that the church had been telling for hundreds of years. And so it kind of fleshes out this life of Mary from her childhood and so forth. And so he does all these paintings. Okay, so it was during this time, and here's one of them, just to kind of take a scene. This is the birth of Mary, and this is her mother, Anna, and this is Mary with the infant Christ. For a newborn, he's giant newborn. He looks like he's 4 months old. The midwife, I guess, pours some water for a bath for the child, and is a symbol of purity. But I wanted to point out something that Ghirlandaio is doing here. When we look at these decorations on the architecture, this is not based on, Judean architecture from the time of Jesus, but rather is all directly based on recent excavations in Rome. There's a hill right across from the Colosseum, and they started digging foundations because they were going to build a building there, I think a church, maybe a palace, and they came upon stones, and they realized that there was architecture buried under this mound of dirt, and they began to excavate it, and they found that it was Nero's palace. That when Nero had died, he had been so hated that they just they took dirt and just piled it up, to when they dug out the basement for the Colosseum, they dumped the dirt on his house. And it's an elaborate mansion. And so all these decorations, like these little cherubs that are here, are derived from these babies that are in this architecture, this same thing here. So it has an almost archaeological feeling to it. And this was very typical of the Renaissance, to try to recreate and have a continuity with the ancient Mediterranean world of the Greeks and the Romans with their idealized art. And Ghirlandaio is a very solid and a good painter to study with. And we do have some very, very early work by Michelangelo while he still was a teenager and while he still was in the company of Ghirlandaio. And one of the things he copied is he went to the Brancacci Chapel to look at the work of Masaccio. And especially this one, it's interesting, the expulsion of Adam and Eve, painted, I guess, in the 30s, the 1430s. And Michelangelo does this drawing when he's a teenager from it. And it's interesting, and Frederick Hart points this out in his book on Italian art of the Renaissance. It's kind of a classic that's been republished a million times. He's trying to, he's inspired, especially in Masaccio, in the heavy gravitas and the muscularity and the solidity and the weight of the figures, almost a sculptural quality. And Michelangelo is really a sculptural painter. When he paints as if he's a sculptor. So he really hews these forms out. Now, an interesting thing Hart mentions is that there's actually an error in the drawing, that this top part of the arm, which I guess is supposed to be foreshortened, seems too short. It comes to the elbow too soon. He's unable to really make it jut out at us in that way. And so the foreshortening is a little compromised. No one would have noticed that. It's a great masterpiece, but he's at the start of the Renaissance, so he's still working these things out. Hart mentions how Michelangelo is grappling. He seems to see the drawing error that Masaccio made, which no one before had seen, and he's trying to redo it by relocating this shoulder a little lower, but that throws the other arm off, which would have to be unusually long to assume this shape. So the drawing isn't perfect, and although he tries to kind of correct what he sees as errors in Masaccio's painting, he can't quite do it yet either. But we have to cut him some slack because he's still a 13-year-old kid, right? It's pretty incredible for that kind of a thing. I wanted to mention that in the 80s, along with the Sistine Chapel being cleaned, less dramatic or controversial certainly were the cleaning of the Brancacci Chapel, and all the smoke and so forth from the years. But also there was fig leaves. We didn't know this until we cleaned them. The fig leaves were painted al secco, or after the rest of the painting had dried, because someone later was embarrassed by the sexuality of it and thought they would cover it up with fig leaves. And actually, Adam and Eve in the Bible, they do cover themselves with fig leaves because they realize after they ate the forbidden fruit that they're naked. And so really it's kind of more biblically correct. So we never questioned there being fig leaves until we started cleaning. We found that they're in complete glorious nudity. Well, an interesting development, certainly fortunate for Michelangelo's career, was that he was sort of discovered by Lorenzo the Magnificent and is invited to live with him. This is a sculpture by Verrocchio of Lorenzo, not a handsome man, but a very erudite and a very wealthy and a very cultured man. And he was part of that banking family that dominated Florentine politics. He was never really officially the prince, but he operated kind of behind the scenes and is largely responsible with the rest of the family of a lot of monuments that we have today are the results of his generosity and his wanting to make his own mark on this era. So he was really an intellectual of the highest order. And he came into, it is said by Vasari, our main source, that he came into, we also have another biography by Condivi. So in Michelangelo, we have two biographies from his life time that were written during his lifetime. But according to Vasari, Lorenzo comes in, he starts talking to the 13-year-old Michelangelo and is just absorbed. And they go around looking at the paintings and he's holding forth on them. And Lorenzo is really kind of flabbergasted that this talented teenager is able to hold forth with such authority and is such an intelligent and developed mind. And he actually spends the whole afternoon speaking with Michelangelo, and Ghirlandaio kind of just leaves them be. And And then the next day he comes back and he approaches Michelangelo. He said, leave Ghirlandaio, move into the Medici palace with me. You are the incarnation sort of everything that we believe human beings to be possible of, that you really do seem to have this divine spark. And I want to have you in my court, just as sort of a resident genius. And Michelangelo said, okay. And he left Ghirlandaio and he never finished his apprenticeship. He never made it to that level of even junior journeyman, much less a maestro. He was never certified by the guild. Nonetheless, because of his powerful patronage, not only the Medici family, but later the Della Rovere family and and the Pope in Rome, Julius II, he begins to have somehow in here, he learns how to sculpt. And we don't have any record of him ever studying sculpture. And this is kind of truly odd. This is the garden, the courtyard garden of Lorenzo the Magnificent there in the Medici Palace. It's now, a museum you can walk. This part's free. You can just walk in and see those lovely orange trees. They don't have oranges on them now, but they do. And that was the symbol of the Medici family. So remember that Lorenzo had a whole circle of intellectuals that would meet. The chief artist was Sandro Botticelli, and Michelangelo moved into this circle as sort of the charmed golden boy of that was almost an illustration of God's inspiration and his ability to work through the genius of a human being. And somewhere in here, he began to do sculpture. I brought this in just to show you Botticelli. Botticelli was really the central artist in that circle of Lorenzo the Magnificent. And in this painting we looked at before, I mentioned that he does put these peacocks in, and that's a reference to the Medici because they actually had peacocks that came all the way from China, the exotic creatures that lived there in the garden of Lorenzo. And as they were having these heady discussions about God and the divine and life and the Greeks and the Romans and so forth, and philosophy and poetry and the role of the artist in society, Michelangelo just sat enraptured. Also, Michelangelo was not treated as a court artist would have been treated by other princes. Because even though, an artist was part of the court, typically they would not eat dinner with the family. This would be something that they'd eat in the kitchen with the servants, but not Michelangelo. As a teenage boy, he sat right at the right hand of Lorenzo the Magnificent, and perhaps there might even have been some discord there because later on, one of the sons of Lorenzo, Giovanni, becomes Pope Leo X. And Leo doesn't like to work with Michelangelo. He's too temperamental. And he sends him back to Florence to work on the Medici tombs. This is a self-portrait of Botticelli. So he was the leading artist at the time in that circle. And part of what was being discussed was Neoplatonic aesthetics. And as I said, Michelangelo seems almost to be the incarnation of these ideas. And as we looked at the Doryphorus or the spear bearer before, remember that this is the canon that was the ideal proportions that were shared by the classical world literally for hundreds of years before the fall of Rome. The proportions remain the same. This was seen as the ideal proportions as they appear in a non-material world beyond time and space from which the human soul comes. And that's what the Plato believed, was that we had a pre-existence as a angelic, non-material being in this world of perfect forms, and then we were born into this world, but then when we died, we re-entered that world of perfect forms. And the Renaissance that was always trying to find balance and harmony, trying to harmonize these pagan ideas of the pre-Christian Mediterranean classical world with the ideas of Christian incarnation, of Jesus being literally a blueprint or an incarnation of the divine. And the idea was that our works of art would not only reflect an ideal world, but actually would help transform our world into the kingdom of God. So there was definitely a Christian spin put on this classicism, and Michelangelo was a devout disciple of both these things. Now, the classical proportions call for 7 heads as the perfect height. We also notice in the Doryphorus this posture called Contemposto that we find in many, many ancient statues and in Renaissance work as well. And that is a sort of balanced asymmetricality, contrapposto, like counterpoise or a counter posture. And it's a posture in which all of the, here's my arrow, all of the weight is taken by this leg, which is called the engaged leg. And that pivots the hips to go at this angle. Then the shoulders go at the opposite angle, and the whole thing is slightly turned. And you can see the head is the final thing. The engaged leg can be the other leg as well. But this balance, asymmetrical balance of forms, and of weight-bearing forms and non-weight-bearing forms, of straight forms like the engaged leg and the arm and the right arm, and the bent forms like the supporting left leg and the left arm that held originally the spear. This is my favorite copy. The original is in bronze and it's lost, but there's several copies. The one there was the one that was in the Vatican. This is the one in Minneapolis, which I think is just absolutely beautiful, but it's missing, you know, its arm, but it has that incredible, it's an incredible piece. Well, of course, Sandro Botticelli is the artist par excellence of this circle, a fully mature artist, and this was made before Michelangelo, but only a few years, 4 or 5 years before Michelangelo moved into the palace. And it's the birth of Venus, and she's the goddess of beauty. And so Florence clothes her with the mantle of art. So it's really a manifesto of the whole idea of giving birth, of incarnating perfect forms that are in the mind of God. And doing it with the narrative of ancient mythology, not because he believed in the ancient gods, but because he was trying to rival the Greco-Roman world kind of on their own terms and use the mythology as a metaphor for Christian ideas. The face of this is just incredible, and you know, is still so close to our ideal forms. It was, however, largely derived from this, the Medici Venus, which is in the collection of Lorenzo the Magnificent. And that's another incredible thing about being part of this circle, and especially for Michelangelo, who actually lived in the house and was kind of a member of the family for a few years. And so he had a chance to study firsthand all this classical statuary that the Medici family had amassed over the last 100 years, previous 100 years. And among them is this lovely Medici Venus that is a Roman copy of a lost original by Praxiteles from the 4th century BC, a Greek thing. And he derived the proportions, just as Polyclitus had put forth the proportions of the male figure, so this artist, Polyclitus, I forget his name now, I just had said it. This is what happens when you turn 65. You forget things as you're going along. I'm in school when I have, you know, my students, I'll lose my train of thought and I'll say, what was I just saying? And they said, you said Leonardo returned to Florence, and I pick it right up there as things flow away from me. Anyway, this Medici Venus was in the circle of in the collection of Lorenzo the Magnificent. So Michelangelo had firsthand knowledge. He was familiar with stuff directly and could study it. There was also a curator, a live-in. He was part of the staff at the Medici Palace, and his job was as a connoisseur and to label all the work and date it and try to, organize it by iconography and style and date and all that sort of art historical kind of stuff. His name was Bartoldo, and he was not an art historian. He was trained as a sculptor, and he had studied with Donatello, the famous early Renaissance sculptor. And so it has been conjectured that it was through Bertoldo that Michelangelo first started experimenting and first got his hands on sculpture, because he did not study it with Ghirlandaio, because Ghirlandaio did not do sculpture. Here's one of the very earliest sculptures we have by Michelangelo, and he's still a teenager here. He's maybe 14 years old. It's called the Madonna of the Stairs, and it's in low relief, which means instead of the figures coming out more three-dimensionally, they're closer to flatness and closer to the flatness of the picture plane. And he shows this beautiful, it's a small piece, masterfully done. This low relief takes a lot of skill, because the slightest error will be noticeable, because the relief is so low. It's almost like painting or scratching in kind of a thing. And so, and especially as you go deeper into the background, these little angels, and angels don't have wings in Michelangelo's world, but these little cherubs hanging on the stairway. It's been suggested that this represents the stairway that Jacob's ladder to heaven, the stairway to the divine. And the Virgin is a metaphor. The mother of Jesus is a metaphor for the stairway to heaven that we climb up it via her, so that she's sort of the conduit and the stairway and the entryway and the threshold to heaven, as well as the Queen of Heaven and all that sort of Catholic stuff. I think one of the interesting things here, I have a close-up of it here, you can see the incredible detail, I think particularly moving, and the child is nursing his mother. I think this limp hand, as he kind of falls asleep as he's suckling her breast, he sort of loses himself. I think it's a beautiful naturalistic touch that he brings, and the incredible grace of these fingers. But you can see in the background that it's really not finished, that parts of it are just kind of roughed out. The angels, it's kind of an unfinished piece. And in fact, Michelangelo often left unfinished pieces, and they're kind of interesting in their own way. Not as many unfinished things as Leonardo, but we do get an insider's kind of view by examining some of these things that he didn't finish. We get an insider's view of how he worked. This is also a very early one from his teen years while he lived with Lorenzo the Magnificent. And this is a battle of Lapis and Centaurs, the Centaurs being half man, half a horse. And it's a fairly small sculpture, but it's in much higher relief than the Madonna of the Stairs. You see how much closer to the picture plane this is. Michelangelo said in a writing later, that many years later, that sculpture is greatest the farther it gets from painting. That high relief sculpture is superior to low relief sculpture, like the Madonna of the Stairs, because it more enters into the real world and gives physical material form to the ideas in the mind of the artist. But here again, we see these wonderful struggling male figures. You can hardly pick out the horse hooves, are just kind of lost amid the frenzy of it all. And again, this one is unfinished. The incredible thing though is, and this is, I don't know if I made it clear enough, but if you had a great deal of intuitive knowledge, you could begin to sculpt on your own if you had plastic sort of medium like clay or wax, which is malleable, and you can add and you can subtract and you can mush and you can smooth. And I can understand how someone, even if they hadn't had specific training, because of just the physicality of the medium, could pick up some clay and maybe really do some interesting things, is you can revise clay. If the nose is too big, you can make the nose smaller. If the nose is too small, you can make it bigger. You can't do that with marble. Once you chip something away, it's gone. So it's a very unforgiving medium. And isn't it interesting that this is the very medium that Michelangelo specializes in, is this very recalcitrant medium that doesn't really want to, that's very difficult to maneuver. And that made it seem all the more supernatural, sort of, that he was able to be so good with marble, because how can someone have that sort of natural affinity? Michelangelo, by the way, he was raised outside of Florence, and when he was a baby, they gave him to a wet nurse during his before he was weaned, and this was kind of typical of middle-class people in that time. And his wet nurse was the wife of a stone cutter and a stonemason. And so he often later said that I drank the milk of the stonemason's wife, and drank that in as an infant. And so that's why I have such affinity for sculpture. He also shows his knowledge of contemporaneous art. This is just a few years earlier by Antonio del Palaiuolo, that's a difficult one, Palaiuolo, Battle of Nude Men, an engraving. And here, again, he shows these figures in action, and with their muscles flaring and so forth. And in his etching, it's almost like a diagram. There's one figure here with his arm raised in this posture, and then right across from him is almost a mirror image, almost as if they're doing a ballet or something like that. There's this other figure that almost shows the same posture from the back. And the same thing on the sides. There's a man bending over in the left forehand, and there's another figure bending over the opposite way. And he kind of deports them around the surface of the painting that kind of intertwine. But they have a flatness to them. The background seems not to be a real forest, but to be almost like a stage curtain. And there's a certain two-dimensionality to it. Although Michelangelo is very turned on and excited by all the action going on. But I think in his Battle of Lapis and Centaurs, as young as he is, he's more advanced than Palaiuolo, because the sculptures are more intertwined. They're more truly three-dimensional, and they really begin to emerge from that picture plane in a writhing sort of conundrum of different bodies. And later on, in the famous duel he has sort of with Leonardo da Vinci, when they're both given commissions by the city of Florence, the unfinished painting that's cartoon for these from his mature years, when he's in his 30s, he really shows how he develops the same direction that he was going when he was 13 or 14 later on in his life. And this will, the male body in action is his main subject matter. Also, when he's very young, he did the beautiful Crucifix in wood. And it's the only sculpture we have of him in wood. And again, it's not like, well, for your first sculpture, it's lovely, try. It's perfection. It's a little crucifix, and it actually hangs in the San Lorenzo church in the sacristy. It's in the sacristy, the dressing room for the Mass, which is still a church, and it's a church right across from the Lorenzo Magnificence Palace. It was his parish church. And so this lovely nude figure, when they show it now, there's a little loincloth they put around it for modesty's sake, I guess. But it's the incredible, unlike the sort of writhing muscularity of his battle of nude men and centaurs, this has this grace and this charm and this, it's not a writhing bodies, it's a meditative, serene sort of piece. He doesn't seem to be writhing in pain, but opening his arms in sort of an embrace, a wide embrace as he looks down at you. And they position it in the church it's really, exquisite sculpture. And here it is in the sacristy, designed by Brunelleschi 100 years previously. And he uses this beautiful Petra Serena, this warm gray stone that's local to Tuscany, local to Florence and the environs. And this is just one of the most exquisite little things. And it's just, he kind of turns it off. And that's the only attempt he ever made at wood sculpture. He, early in his career, I think he's like 20 years old, maybe 21. Lorenzo, of course, perishes in 92, and he's back at his father's house. He never finishes his apprenticeship because the connections he made with Lorenzo the Magnificent continued to patronize him. And so this is a sculpture, it's life-size, and it's of Bacchus, the god of wine. And again, he's using the same posture of Contemposto that we had seen in the Greek statue, but now the god of wine. Now, this is what I think is humorous and wonderful about this particular sculpture, is the spin he does on Bacchus. Bacchus is the god of wine. And in this sculpture, he shows the god really intoxicated with wine. And his body sort of weaves back and forth with his unstable, drunkenness. And then down on the side, this little faun with his goat's feet is nibbling at the grapes. But Bacchus, beyond consciousness, doesn't even notice it. What I want to point out, though, is that this is a witty response to Contemposto, whereas Contemposto is supposed to be the body at rest with this balanced, harmonious, serene Contemposto. But here he makes it into a writhing thing, and so puts an odd kind of spin, a humorous spin on the tradition by showing Bacchus intoxicated in this way. And if you look at his face, you can get right up close to it. It is in the Bargello Museum in Florence, and you look at those eyes, and it's like he can't even focus. He's so far gone into drunkenness. I wanted to point out too that in Italian culture, that public drunkenness is very shameful, and you just don't see people that drink. It's very shameful. It's unmanly. And so that adds to the kind of humor of the whole thing, is the strong taboo they have against public drunkenness. And it's interesting that although they may drink a half a bottle of wine at lunch every day, they have a lot of control. And and so there aren't, they don't even have laws about who can buy a bottle of wine. A 10-year-old could go to the liquor store and buy a bottle of wine and bring it home. And there's very low incidence of alcoholism. It's interesting. The social pressure itself does it. But if you understand it within that context, it's a wonderfully playful dalliance with this ancient god of drunkenness. Well, this led to his first major commission that he had when he was 22 years old, for a French cardinal in residence in Rome. So this is his first, he had made trips to Rome, but this was his first kind of major commission. And it was exhibited in St. Peter's, and it's there now, but it was first premiered, I guess, there, and people came to see it. It is now, the statue was damaged in the 1960s. A crazy person, I mean, literally a schizophrenic, came in with a sledgehammer and knocked off the arm of the Virgin, hit the face. Some of the marble came off. It was a horrible tragedy. I think it was done in 1965, 66. I remember it as a kid. And, but 3M was able to, put it together marvelously, and it looks nice, but they've set it up and they sort of lean it forward a little, and it's behind, 3 layers of bulletproof glass. And so, it's distant, but the way he made it, it's the Virgin's larger than life size. So she becomes kind of a throne on which the frail swimmer's build, idealized body of Christ lies limp across her lap. The faces are, and even after the restoration by 3M, the faces still have that incredible beauty and youth, and a meditative kind of quality. Look at how beautifully the beard is just incised in the marble. It just sort of appears in low relief. The ideal quality of the sculpture is just, it's breathtaking. There is also here, I wanted to point out, again, this flaccidity of the flesh that Michelangelo has that the ancient Greeks and Romans don't. There's this hardness to the stone, this resistance to plasticity. But Michelangelo, in his hands, he's able to, I think, for example, the way the flesh sort of bends under the weight of his arm, and how her fingers impress the soft flesh of Christ. It's truly amazing. And he brings it to this high level of finish. And I wanted to point out one more thing. Condivi tells us that Michelangelo was there at St. Peter's when it was first exhibited. He's a 22-year-old person, and that some French people come in and they comment, well, this must have done by a Frenchman or a German. No Italian would have done this, because actually it's a theme of Mary, of Jesus lying in the lap of Mary, that is common in German art and French art and English art, but isn't common at all in Italian art. And it might have been, because the patron was French, as I mentioned, French cardinal. But these people, that couldn't be done by Italian, must have been Frenchman, must have been German. And so Michelangelo came back and he carved, Michelangelo Buonarroti made this. Well, actually, the grammar is odd. He says, Michelangelo was making this. And it has to do with these Neoplatonic ideas of the divine form coming into being under the fingers of the artist. So that it's almost the artist just moves away, and the Holy Spirit works through him, making the sculpture for him, sort of. And so he, was making it, implies that it's not finished and that it will never be finished, that the whole project of bringing the ideas in the mind of God into physical form in our universe and our architecture and our art and our painting and sculpture and so forth, these ideas are never finished. It's always a project in the making. And I think that's that use of that grammar Michelangelo was making this, is an interesting spin on it. We also, around the same time, he gets his first, he produces his only oil painting. We have no other, there are some unfinished fragments of oil painting in the British Museum, in the National Gallery in London. But this is the only finished oil painting. And once again, it's not like, well, for a first attempt, pretty good. He also designed the frame, who was carved by another artist. But I want to get down to, it's a tondo. It's one of these round paintings. They're very difficult to compose in, because if you don't get it balanced, it always looks like it's going to roll one way or another. And so the typical thing has to stabilize the roundness with triangular forms, because a triangle is a very stable figure, because smaller on the top than on the bottom. And so, for example, in Botticelli, Madonna and Child, a tondo by that earlier artist, you can see kind of clearly, if I get my arrow to show up, a triangular form that starts here, kind of goes up here and comes down there, stabilizing the whole thing. And then he stabilizes it further by the throne that she's in, that sort of centers her in nice stable composition. Michelangelo's, however, is more of a pyramid shape. It has much more of a sculptural quality. It has more of a sense of presence and being and gravitas and weight, and is almost could be a sculptural figures there. I mean, there almost could be a group that's carved out of one piece of marble. And some of his later pietas are actually that. They seem, they have a sculptural three-dimensional quality. He also just is, has such a perfect technique. And again, Ghirlandaio doesn't do oil paint. So he certainly didn't learn oil painting during his couple of years as an apprentice. Yet when he turns his hand to oil painting, he does it with the complete mastery of someone who's been doing it for decades. And it's just absolutely incredible. The softness of the cheek of the Virgin or of the infant Christ. And I want to point out too, how this is different, although it's high Renaissance, it's very different than the kind of thing that Leonardo was doing. Leonardo in this painting, for example, the Madonna, the yarn winder, has this sfumato, this smoky, misty quality that kind of blurs the edges of everything and makes it seem sort of mysterious and so forth. And then if we take and see that line of that cheek, it's just so soft, so much in kind of like soft focus photography. But if we put that next to Michelangelo, look at the clarity of form. He actually outlines the figure with a line. Here a brown line, in some places a darker blue line. And it's just, although it's equally as authoritative, high Renaissance, it's a very different character, a very much more clarity, much more kind of sculptural way of thinking of form, as if it's being sculpted in three-dimensional space instead of merely alluded to. I want to point out also the background. There's a strange young men bathing, I guess. They're all naked. It's kind of a skinny dip thing. Seems odd to us, and we really don't know what they're supposed to be. It has been seen as an indication of Michelangelo's homosexuality, because we found out that later, when he's in his 50s, he writes love sonnets to a young man who's in his 20s. And so people have said the way that this man has his arm around his buddy is kind of homosexual. But, you know, I'm very leery of these kind of interpretations, because here in Italy, men touch each other a lot more than they do in our American society. There's a much that this sort of thing is, so I think we have to be very careful when we're trying to make those kinds of assumptions and draw those kinds of conclusions. I'm not saying Michelangelo, you know, wasn't attracted to men. He was, and the male figure is his major subject matter throughout his life. But this is his real only attempt at oil painting. I want to point out too the strange color harmonies, orange and pink. If you're a painter and you try to make those two clashing colors work together, they don't. They have a clashing, acidic almost quality. Michelangelo is somehow able to use these clashing colors in ways that are harmonious. He somehow overcomes the strange dissonance of the colors and brings them to a higher harmony. And it's really hard to figure out how we could have done this without a lot of training, without a lot of, and also we have to remember that the Sistine ceiling, which was cleaned in the 80s, we used to say they're all browns and grays because Michelangelo just was a sculptor. He wasn't familiar with color, he wasn't a master of color, so he just kept it very, very muted in color, very browns, a lot of grays. But we found since the cleaning that there are actually brilliant colors in the Sistine Chapel ceiling. If we had only looked at the Doni Tondo, his only oil painting, we could see that this propensity for very saturated, clashing, but somehow unified color is characteristic of his work. Also around this time, and you know, patronage began to pour in. He began more and more commissions. And he was commissioned to do a copy of Donatello's David, and he did some sketches for it. And this is still in his, I guess, mid-20s. And I want to point out how he changed the position of it. The copy is lost, but he was commissioned to do a bronze copy of the Donatello. But if in this drawing anyway, he does really change the posture. And you can see that Donatello's David is standing triumphantly with his foot on the beheaded head of Goliath, with a stone in his hand behind. But I want to point out too, right here, this arm upside down. So let's turn the piece of paper upside down, and we can see that that arm is actually not a study from Donatello, but it's a study for his David. And David is this fantastic sculpture. And he's 29 when he's given this commission. It's an 18-foot high solid piece of Carrara marble, which is very expensive to get that large of a piece. Yet, what had happened is the stone had been ruined by an earlier sculptor that had been fired. And one of the problems with marble is, and I've never worked with marble, so, but I've just been told this, is that you have to be very careful because the different veins, the colored veins in the marble are weaker spots in the marble, and you really have to be very careful that it doesn't crack along those fissures. If you do it wrong, that happens, and that happened. And it was ruined. It was 18 feet tall, and it was so thin that they couldn't figure out how we're going to ever get some sort of a figure, anything out of this. And so the town, and this was after the fall of Savonarola, the town asked Michelangelo, what shall we do with this piece of marble? And Michelangelo walked around the marble, studied it, and then he said an amazing thing. He said, David is in there. And I have only to release him from the stone for him to live. And indeed, it is an amazing sculpture. And it isn't an amazing sculpture. He did as good as he could. He did as well as he could with a ruined piece of marble. That's not what it looks like. It looks like this was designed from the very beginning. And it's interesting, Michelangelo talked about the presence of the soul of David already there, dormant in the marble. So again, it's that idea of in the making, of, he says was making, because it's the process of chipping away the stone that reveals the ideal form underneath. And this David, he picks a different point than Donatello's David. David has not yet conquered Goliath, but he's looking glaringly at Goliath. And he has his slingshot over his shoulder, and in his other arm, he holds the stone. And he stands, every muscle in his body ready to spring into action. His posture is like the Doryphorus in that it has that Contemposto, but unlike the Doryphorus, which is a body at rest, it's a very serene sort of posture. David, his muscles are tensed. It's an anticipatory moment that brings us to this kind of climax in the story where he's really eyeing out Goliath, and it's the few moments before he springs into action. It kind of reminds me of my cat when he's being very, very quiet and the mouse is nibbling on something, and then suddenly he pounces on it, right? And that kind of, that built up tension that's ready to explode, that they call Michelangelo's terribile, his terribleness, his terribile, right? That it's this moment before the explosion. And so he always captures that moment of tenseness before the release. And he does it first and most magnificently in David. As we walk around David, David is a sculpture in the round, we notice that he is very skinny. And this is a result of the deformations in the marble that Michelangelo had to work with. But he brilliantly adapts that to the young, skinny, lithe, muscular body of David. And David is obviously, this is maybe a 16 or 17-year-old, not like the 13-year-old, David depicted by Donatello 75 years earlier. And if we walk all the way around, we can see he also puts a little tree trunk there by the foot, by the leg, just to further stabilize, because it's such a titanic colossus. It's 18 foot tall. It was designed originally for the bell tower of the cathedral, but then they decided to put it up right in front of the town hall, the Palazzo Vecchio that we looked at earlier, that had been the palace of the Duke, but then later was converted into a town hall of the commune of Florence, and so was closer to a town hall, wasn't a residence any longer. And as a symbol of Florentine democracy, as a symbol of the Republic, especially after the Republic had been violated by Savonarola's crazy dictatorship in the 90s, that we mentioned before. Now that Savonarola had been executed by the Pope, it was time to come back to the Renaissance. And this was a symbol of the rejuvenation of the Republic. So that David is not really so much a religious sculpture, although it's a theme taken from the Bible. It's really more of a sculpture of Florentine independence, that unlike Rome or Milan, these giant centers ruled by an aristocratic duke or by the Pope, Florence was a free, independent republic. It was like David, young, lithe, powerful, but not through brawn, but through brain and through those quick reactions. Now, the David was taken out of its place in front of the town hall in the late 19th century because rain and so forth had begun to, some of the hair and some of the detail, especially the hair, began to lose definition after a lot of rain. They also cleaned it with acid in the 19th century, which made it shining and bright, but also wore away the detail. And they don't do that anymore. They're much more conservative. But so they, at the end of the 19th century, they decided to take the statue into the Accademia. That is the School of Art, the Academy, which was formed after hundreds of years after Michelangelo was dead. But that's where it is today. However, an absolutely perfect, a copy of it is still there in front of the Palazzo Vecchio, made by these 19th century craftsmen. And it is so perfect that I don't think it's really worth going to see the original in the Accademia, because it's so crowded with people usually flashing their cameras and everything, that it's much more serene and indistinguishable from the original is this beautiful copy that's placed in the town hall. They did originally, like the earlier crucifix, the wooden crucifix that he did, 15 years earlier, they also made a little fig leaf out of bronze that was put like an apron around him. But now, of course, he's totally gloriously nude. And I want to point out this face. If the David's face is with the knotted brow and the intense scrutiny that his eyes show of his foe, that face is the incarnation of terribila, right? Well, after this great success, at the age of 29, his future was golden. And it was at this point in 1505 that the new Pope, Julius II, ascended to the throne. And his predecessor, Pope Alexander VI, had been a very corrupt pope, whose bastard son he sent to conquer Italy. And his torture chambers, he was a notoriously gangsterish pope. And when Pope Julius came in, he wanted to clean up the office of popery, and he wanted to make it respectable again because it had been kind of taken over by thugs and demagogues. And he thought, we're going to restore the dignity of this. Yet he was very worldly in his own way. One of the things Pope Julius wanted to do was to redo Rome, make it a showplace as the center of the Roman Catholic Church. And one of the most important things Pope Julius II did was to tear down the old St. Peter's that was built way back in the 4th century and replaced it by the building that's there now. It was started by this Pope Julius II. This is a portrait of the Pope done later by Raphael Santi, Michelangelo, another of Michelangelo's great younger rivals. But Michelangelo is called to Rome to do a vast tomb to immortalize Pope Julius. And so he idealizes, I mean, look at the idealization from this frail old man to this vigorous Moses, an idealization of the Pope as this vigorous, muscular Moses, the liberator of his people. And he wanted to make that.
This call may be recorded or monitored for quality purposes. Para continuar en español.
I don't know what that is, but it's probably a sign that we should open it up for questions. I want to return in my next lecture and begin.